My husband looked me straight in the eyes and told me I was imagining things. 3 hours later, his own daughter sent me the auction receipt for my mother's jewelry. I opened the safe because I wanted to wear my mother's sapphire bracelet to her memorial luncheon. My fingers already knew exactly where the velvet box would be. Top shelf. Back corner. Wrapped in the pale cream cloth my mother had sewn herself almost 30 years ago. But the moment I opened the door, something felt wrong. The shelf looked too empty. Too clean. My chest tightened as I reached inside and pulled out the red velvet case. It felt lighter than it should have. I remember staring at it for several seconds before opening it, almost like part of me already knew what I was about to see. Empty slots. Empty velvet grooves where my mother's rings, necklaces, and bracelets had rested for decades. Gone? Every single piece. Even the pearl earrings she wore on the day my father returned home from Vietnam. I just stood there in silence, holding that empty box in both hands while the late afternoon sun stretched across the bedroom carpet. 41 years of marriage teaches you how to recognize the sound of footsteps in your home. I heard Richard coming upstairs before he reached the hallway. Calm. Steady. Unhurried. The footsteps of a man who didn't think he'd done anything wrong. Richard, I called softly as he entered the room. Where's my mother's jewelry? He stopped near the dresser, one hand still holding his coffee mug. For a second, something flickered across his face. Not guilt. Annoyance. Like I'd interrupted his evening. What jewelry? He asked. I looked down at the empty case in my hands. My mother's collection. The sapphire bracelet. The wedding ring. All of it. He sighed heavily and walked toward the bathroom, without looking directly at me. Evelyn, maybe you misplaced it. Misplaced it. I almost laughed. My mother had died 11 years ago, and I had kept those pieces in the exact same place every single day since the funeral. I polished them twice a year myself. I still remembered the smell of her rose perfume lingering on one of the silk pouches the first time I opened the box after she passed away. I didn't misplace anything, I said quietly. Richard leaned against the bathroom doorway and crossed his arms. Then maybe somebody moved it. Somebody. We were the only two people living in the house. The silence between us felt strange suddenly. Heavy. Like there was something standing in the room besides the two of us. Richard took a sip of coffee and shrugged. You've been under stress lately with the memorial planning. Maybe you forgot you moved it somewhere else. I stared at him for a long moment. This was the same man who used to warm my side of the bed before winter nights because my feet were always cold. The same man who held my hand at my mother's funeral while I cried into his jacket collar. But standing there in that doorway, avoiding my eyes, he felt like a stranger wearing my husband's face. You really think I'd forget where my mother's jewelry is? I asked. His jaw tightened slightly. I think you're overreacting. Then he walked downstairs. Just like that. No concern. No questions. No offer to help look for it. I sat on the edge of the bed as the house grew quiet again around me. Outside the bedroom window, rain clouds gathered over the maple trees lining our street. The grandfather clock downstairs ticked steadily through the silence. Tick. 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 Like time itself was warning me that something in my life had shifted. My phone buzzed against the nightstand around 7 that evening. I almost ignored it until I saw Claire's name on the screen. Richard's daughter rarely called me directly. Hello. I answered. There was breathing on the other end for a second before she finally spoke. Evelyn, she said softly. Please don't ask Dad about the jewelry again. My stomach tightened instantly. What are you talking about? Silence. Then I heard her exhale shakily. He already sold everything 3 weeks ago. I felt the room tilt around me. What? I didn't know how to tell you, Claire whispered. I found the auction receipt in his office tonight. I gripped the edge of the mattress so hard my fingers hurt. Downstairs, I could hear Richard turning on the television like it was any other normal evening in our home. But suddenly, after 41 years together, I realized I had no idea who my husband really was. I barely slept that night. Richard came to bed around 11, moving carefully through the darkness like he always did when he thought I was already asleep. I kept my eyes closed and listened to the familiar sounds that had once comforted me. The rustle of his shirt hitting the chair. The soft creak of the mattress dipping beneath his weight. The quiet sigh he always made before settling onto his back. For more than 4 decades, those sounds had meant safety to me. Stability. Home. But lying there beside him, all I could think about was the empty velvet box sitting upstairs in my dresser drawer. I wondered if he had slept peacefully the past 3 weeks knowing exactly what he had done. Around 2 in the morning, I heard him get up again. His footsteps moved quietly down the hallway toward his office. A few seconds later, the faint glow of light appeared beneath the door downstairs. Richard had always hated being questioned about money. Even in the early years of our marriage, he handled every account, every investment, every tax return. At first, I thought it was love. Protection. He used to kiss my forehead and say, "You worry too much, Evelyn. Let me take care of the stressful things." And for many years, I believed him. My mother used to warn me about that kind of dependence. Never give anyone complete control over your life, she would say while polishing her jewelry at the kitchen table. Not even a husband. I used to laugh whenever she said things like that. My parents had been married for 53 years. My father adored her until the day he died. To me, marriage meant trust so complete you never needed to question it. Now, at 67 years old, I sat alone in the dark realizing how dangerous blind trust could become. The next morning, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows while I made coffee. Richard came downstairs freshly shaved, dressed in one of his navy golf sweaters. Calm. Ordinary. Like nothing in our lives had changed overnight. "Morning," he said casually as he opened the refrigerator. I watched him carefully while he poured orange juice into a glass. His hands looked steady. Relaxed. Not the hands of a man carrying guilt. "Morning," I answered quietly. He glanced at me for a second. "Did you sleep okay?" The question almost made my chest ache. After 41 years together, he could still sound caring without meaning a word of it. "Not really," I admitted. I kept thinking about my mother's jewelry. A flicker crossed his face again. Irritation. Then it disappeared. "Evelyn, I already told you. We will figure it out." "We?" The word sounded false coming from him now. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug to stop them from trembling. "Claire called me last night." His body went still for half a second. Barely noticeable. But I saw it. "Claire," he repeated carefully. "Why?" "She said you sold the jewelry." Silence filled the kitchen instantly. Outside, thunder rumbled somewhere far across the neighborhood. Richard slowly placed his glass down on the counter. "And you believed her?" he asked. His voice had changed. Colder now. Sharper. I stared at him across the kitchen island, trying to recognize the man standing in front of me. "Did you?" I asked softly. Richard let out a long breath through his nose and shook his head like he was exhausted by the entire conversation. "Claire has been emotional lately. You know how she gets." He reached for his car keys hanging beside the pantry. I do not have time for this drama this morning. Drama. That word settled into my stomach like ice. My mother's jewelry was not expensive because of diamonds or gold. Some pieces were valuable, yes, but that was never the point. Those necklaces and bracelets carried entire generations of women inside them. Birthdays. Weddings. Funerals. My mother wore the sapphire bracelet while holding my hand after my miscarriage at 32. She wore the pearl earrings during Sunday dinners every week of my childhood. Those pieces held memories Richard could never understand because sentiment meant nothing to a man who measured everything in dollars. Where did the money go? I asked quietly. Richard froze near the front door. Slowly, he turned around. Excuse me. The money from the jewelry. Where did it go? For the first time in years, I saw something dangerous flicker behind his eyes. Not sadness. Not shame. Anger. The kind that appears when someone realizes their control is slipping. You are upsetting yourself over nothing, he said tightly. And I am done discussing it. Then he walked out into the rain without another word. I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the front door slam shut. Somewhere upstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 9 times through the silent house. I suddenly realized something terrifying. Richard was not afraid that I knew the truth. He was afraid I might finally stop trusting him. Claire asked me to meet her at a diner 30 minutes outside town. She said she did not want her father seeing her car near the house. I drove there Thursday morning under a grey sky that made everything look washed out and tired. The diner sat beside an old gas station off Interstate 95, the kind of place with cracked leather booths and coffee that tasted stronger than it should. Claire was already waiting when I arrived. She sat near the back corner, with both hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea. The moment she saw me walking toward the table, her face tightened with guilt. Thank you for coming, she said quietly. I slid into the booth across from her and studied her carefully. Claire had Richard's eyes, but none of his coldness. At 38, she still carried the nervous habit of twisting her wedding ring whenever she was upset. She was doing it now. Tell me the truth, I said softly. Her eyes filled immediately. I should have told you sooner. The waitress appeared beside us asking if we wanted menus, but neither of us looked at them. I ordered coffee mostly so my hands would have something to hold. Claire waited until the waitress walked away before reaching into her oversized brown purse. She pulled out several folded papers and placed them carefully on the table between us. Auction documents. Sales receipts. Wire transfers. I stared at my mother's name typed across the inventory list while my heartbeat pounded heavily in my ears. Sapphire bracelet. Pearl earrings. Diamond wedding band. Gold charm necklace. One by one, every piece sat there in black ink with dollar amounts beside them. My throat tightened so badly I could barely breathe. When? I whispered. Claire looked down at the table. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Richard had kissed me goodbye every morning for 3 weeks knowing exactly what he had done. I slowly picked up one of the receipts with trembling fingers. Why? Claire swallowed hard before answering. Dad said he needed temporary cash for an investment problem. Investment problem. The phrase sounded rehearsed, polished smooth from repetition. What kind of problem? I asked. Claire hesitated long enough for me to understand the answer would hurt. He lost money, she admitted quietly. A lot of money. I leaned back against the booth as the waitress delivered our drinks. The smell of bacon and burnt toast filled the diner around us while country music played softly from an old radio near the kitchen. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary people. Meanwhile, my entire marriage felt like it was quietly collapsing inside my chest. Claire waited until the waitress left again before speaking. At first I thought he was going to tell you, she said. But then I heard him talking on the phone last week. Talking to who? A debt advisor. Maybe a lawyer too. I am not sure. She looked exhausted suddenly, older than 38. He said if you found out, everything would fall apart. I stared down at the receipt showing the sale of my mother's sapphire bracelet. $22,000. I remembered sitting beside my mother in a hospital room, while she slipped that bracelet off her wrist and placed it in my hand. One day this goes to your daughter, she had whispered weakly. I never had children of my own. After years of fertility treatments and quiet disappointments, Richard eventually stopped talking about it altogether. But I still kept that bracelet like a promise from one generation of women to the next. Now some stranger owned it because my husband needed money. Claire suddenly reached across the table and touched my hand carefully. There is something else. I looked up slowly. She hesitated before pulling one final paper from her purse. Smaller than the others. Folded twice. I almost did not bring this. I unfolded it carefully. It was another auction listing. But this time my breath caught instantly. My mother's wedding ring. The thin gold band with tiny hand-engraved roses along the inside. The ring my father saved for almost a year to buy after returning from the war. No, I whispered before I could stop myself. Claire looked like she might cry. I know. I kept staring at the paper while grief spread slowly through my chest like cold water. Richard knew what that ring meant to me. He knew I still kept my parents' wedding photo framed beside my bed. He knew I touched that ring every year on my mother's birthday. And he sold it anyway. How long has he been hiding financial problems? I finally asked. Claire looked toward the rain streaking softly against the diner windows. Longer than you think. Something inside me shifted then. Quietly. Permanently. Until that moment, part of me still wanted to believe there had been some explanation. Some misunderstanding. But sitting there in that worn diner booth with auction receipts spread across the table between us, I realized the truth was much worse than one act of betrayal. Richard had not made a mistake. He had made a choice. The drive home felt longer than usual even though the rain had finally stopped. Connecticut looked grey and exhausted beneath the low clouds hanging over the highway. I kept both hands tight on the steering wheel while Claire's words repeated over and over inside my mind. Longer than you think. I used to believe betrayal arrived like shattered glass. Loud. Sudden. Impossible to ignore. But the truth was quieter than that. Betrayal arrived slowly. It lived in tiny moments you dismissed because love trained you not to question them. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. White shutters. Blue hydrangeas lining the walkway. Richard's silver sedan parked neatly beside the garage. 41 years of marriage sitting peacefully behind polished windows. From the outside, we still looked like the kind of couple neighbors admired. The kind people described as stable. Reliable. Lucky. I sat in the car for several minutes before going inside. The silence felt safer out there somehow. Inside the house, every room carried memories that suddenly felt unreliable. The kitchen where Richard used to dance with me while dinner cooked on Sunday nights. The den where we spent winters watching old movies beneath the same wool blanket for 20 years. The backyard patio where he held me after my father died. I used to think love was built from those moments. Now I wondered if love could exist beside deception for decades without you noticing. Richard was upstairs when I entered the house. I could hear the shower running faintly through the ceiling. I walked slowly into his office for the first time in years. He never liked anyone touching his desk. Important papers, he always said with a small smile. I respected that boundary, because marriage had taught me to confuse privacy with trust. The room smelled faintly of leather and aftershave. His desk sat perfectly organized beneath the window overlooking our backyard. Family photos lined the shelves beside investment books and framed golf certificates. I stared at the photograph from our 25th anniversary party. Richard stood beside me with one arm around my waist, smiling proudly into the camera, while our friends toasted us around candlelight tables. I remembered how safe I felt that night. How grateful. Slowly, I opened the top desk drawer. Bank envelopes. Tax files. Utility bills. Everything neat and controlled. The second drawer contained folders labeled in Richard's careful handwriting. Retirement. Insurance. Property taxes. I almost stopped searching then, because part of me still felt guilty for invading his space. Even after everything, habit remained powerful. But then I remembered my mother's wedding ring listed on auction papers, like it was nothing more than inventory. My hands stopped shaking after that. In the bottom drawer, beneath several account statements, I found a folder without a label. Inside were overdue notices, loan extensions, credit warnings. My stomach tightened as I flipped through the pages. Tens of thousands of dollars. Some accounts carried balances I had never seen before. Others were linked to investment companies I did not recognize. One notice stamped in red letters read "Final request for payment." I lowered myself slowly into Richard's office chair, because suddenly my legs felt weak. Richard had always insisted our finances were healthy, comfortable, safe. Every time I offered to review retirement plans together, he brushed the conversation aside. "You worry too much," he would say while kissing my forehead. "I have everything handled." I used to think his confidence made me lucky. Looking back now, I realized it kept me uninformed. There had been signs. Small ones. Quiet ones. 3 years ago, Richard suddenly sold the vintage Mustang he spent a decade restoring. He claimed he was simplifying our lives. Last Christmas, he snapped at me for buying expensive gifts for Claire's children even though we could easily afford them. 2 months ago, he insisted we postpone replacing the leaking roof over the guest bedroom. I told myself aging had simply made him cautious with money. But sitting there in his office surrounded by hidden debt notices, I finally saw the pattern clearly. Richard had not been protecting me from stress. He had been protecting himself from questions. Upstairs, the shower turned off. Water pipes rattled softly through the walls. I quickly placed every document back exactly where I found it and closed the drawer carefully. My heartbeat pounded hard enough to make my chest ache. For the first time in our marriage, I felt afraid of my husband. Not because I thought he would hurt me physically. Richard was too controlled for that. No, what frightened me was colder than anger. It was the realization that the man sleeping beside me every night had been quietly dismantling our life piece by piece, while smiling across the dinner table like nothing was wrong. I heard his footsteps moving across the hallway upstairs. Calm. Familiar. Ordinary. The same footsteps I had trusted for 41 years. But now they sounded different to me somehow. Like the footsteps of someone walking farther and farther away from the truth. Richard acted almost overly normal after that. That was the strange part. I think I could have handled shouting or excuses more easily than the calmness. The following week he continued watering the hydrangeas every morning. He watched the evening news from his recliner with the volume too loud, just like always. He complained about gas prices over dinner, and reminded me that the Lexus needed an oil change before winter. Sometimes I caught myself staring at him across the kitchen table wondering how long he had practiced pretending. One evening he even reached for my hand while we watched television. His thumb brushed gently against my knuckles in the same absent-minded way it had for years. I nearly pulled away. Not because of anger. Because the touch no longer felt honest. It felt rehearsed. I stopped sleeping well after that. Around 3 in the morning, I would wake up and stare at the ceiling while Richard breathed steadily beside me. Every memory from our marriage suddenly returned carrying a second meaning. The anniversary trip to Vermont he cancelled unexpectedly 5 years ago because of a business emergency. The afternoons he locked himself inside his office for hours. The growing irritation whenever I ask simple financial questions. Once you discover someone has been lying, your entire past rearranges itself. Friday afternoon Claire called again, while I was folding laundry in the guest room. Her voice sounded tight with anxiety. "Can you talk?" she asked quietly. "Of course." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I found something else." My stomach tightened instantly. "What is it?" "Dad is trying to refinance the house." The towel slipped from my hands onto the carpet. "What?" "I overheard him arguing with someone on the phone yesterday. He said if the refinancing does not go through, he is out of options." I sat slowly on the edge of the guest bed, while rain tapped softly against the windows again. Connecticut had felt trapped beneath grey skies for days now. "How bad is it?" I whispered. Claire hesitated. "I do not know everything. But Evelyn, I think he owes much more money than he admitted." I closed my eyes briefly. The house. The only home I had lived in for nearly 4 decades. Richard and I bought it when we were both 30 years old after saving 4 years. I still remembered painting the nursery pale yellow even after doctors warned us pregnancy might never happen. I remembered planting the maple tree in the backyard with my father the summer we moved in. Every corner of that house carried pieces of my life inside it. And Richard was gambling with it behind my back. "Why are you helping me?" I asked softly after a moment. Claire went quiet. "Because somebody should have." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I spent years pretending Dad was just difficult. Controlling sometimes. But this is different." I thought about that after we hung up. Difficult. Controlling. Strange how women soften dangerous truths with smaller words just to survive them. My mother used to do the same thing about my father's temper during hard years. "He is under pressure," she would say quietly after he snapped over bills or work stress. Women from my generation learned early how to make excuses for men we loved. That evening Richard came home carrying grocery bags and a bouquet of white roses. "My favorite flowers. Thought these might cheer you up," he said with an easy smile. I looked at the flowers in his hands and suddenly remembered another bouquet from years ago. Red roses delivered after I discovered he had secretly withdrawn money from our savings account during a rough business period in the 1990s. Back then he promised it would never happen again. I believed him because I wanted peace more than truth. "They are beautiful," I said quietly, accepting the bouquet. Richard relaxed slightly, like he had passed some invisible test. During dinner, he talked about replacing the deck next spring, and maybe taking a cruise the following summer. Future plans. Casual dreams. Meanwhile, overdue notices sat hidden in his office drawer like rot beneath polished floorboards. "I was thinking," he said while cutting into his chicken, "maybe we should simplify things financially soon. At our age, less stress makes sense." I looked up slowly. "What do you mean?" "Maybe consolidating accounts. Selling unnecessary assets. Making things easier." Unnecessary assets. My mother's jewelry. Possibly our house next. He spoke about Pieces of our life the same way people discuss old furniture in a garage sale. Calmly. Practically. I set my fork down carefully beside my plate. Richard, I asked softly, have you ever lied awake wondering what happens when trust disappears from a marriage? For the first time in days, he looked genuinely unsettled. Only for a second. Then he smiled faintly and reached for his wine glass. You think too deeply sometimes, Evelyn. Maybe I did. But as I sat there watching the man I had spent 41 years loving, I realized something important. Richard still believed he could smooth this over with flowers, routines, and careful words because he thought my greatest fear was losing him. He had not yet understood that my greatest fear now was discovering how much more he had already taken. The following Monday, I drove to a law office in downtown Stamford without telling Richard where I was going. The building overlooked the harbor, all glass windows and polished marble floors that smelled faintly of expensive coffee and printer ink. I almost turned around twice before reaching the reception desk. Even after everything, part of me still felt disloyal sitting in another man's office discussing my husband. That was the hardest thing about betrayal after a long marriage. Your instincts do not disappear overnight. Your heart still follows old routines long after trust has started dying. Mrs. Harper. A tall silver-haired attorney stepped into the waiting room and offered me a kind smile. I am Daniel Mercer. Please come in. His office overlooked Long Island Sound. Sailboats drifted slowly across the grey water beneath thick clouds, while I sat twisting my wedding ring nervously against my finger. Daniel listened quietly while I explained everything. The missing jewelry. The auction receipts. The hidden debts. Richard's attempt to refinance the house. I expected embarrassment to overwhelm me while speaking the words aloud. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Deeply tired in a way sleep could not fix. Daniel folded his hands carefully on the desk once I finished. Mrs. Harper, he said gently, how involved have you been in your family finances over the years? I gave a small humorless smile. Apparently not involved enough. He nodded slowly like he had heard similar answers many times before. Do you have access to all joint accounts? Some. Retirement statements. Richard usually handled those. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. And the house title? I hesitated. Both names, I think. The moment those words left my mouth, I realized how little certainty I actually had about my own life. Richard always signed papers quickly during tax season while explaining things in rushed summaries I stopped questioning years ago. I need copies of everything you can find, Daniel said calmly. Accounts. Property records. Loans. Insurance policies. Anything connected to your finances. I looked down at my hands. Do you think he could lose the house? Daniel chose his next words carefully. I think your husband may be under financial pressure significant enough to make dangerous decisions. Dangerous decisions. Such polite words for the slow destruction of a shared life. Before leaving, Daniel handed me a slim black folder. There is one more thing, he said gently. Do not confront him emotionally right now. I looked up. Why? Because people who feel cornered financially often become unpredictable. Stay calm. Gather information first. Calm. That part came easier than he probably realized. By the time I drove home that afternoon, something inside me had changed. The grief was still there. The betrayal too. But underneath both emotions, something colder had begun settling into place. Clarity. Richard was counting on confusion. On guilt. On my instinct to protect the marriage before protecting myself. For the first time in decades, I stopped thinking like a wife and started thinking like someone who needed the truth. When I pulled into the driveway, Richard's car was already home. Through the front window, I could see him standing in the kitchen making coffee like any ordinary Monday afternoon. I watched him quietly for a moment before going inside. "You are home early," he said casually when I entered. "Errands," I answered while setting my purse down. He glanced toward me briefly. "Everything okay?" Such a simple question. Once, hearing concern in his voice would have comforted me instantly. Now I listened more carefully to what he was not saying. He did not ask where I had gone. He did not ask why I looked exhausted. He only wanted reassurance that his carefully balanced world was still intact. "Everything is fine," I replied softly. Richard relaxed slightly and returned to pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "I was thinking maybe we should have dinner out this weekend," he said. "Maybe that Italian place near the marina you like." Guilt. I recognized it now. Not remorse for what he had done. Fear that I might drift too far away emotionally before he regained control of the situation. "That sounds nice," I said quietly. The lie came easier than I expected. Later that evening, after Richard fell asleep in front of the television downstairs, I entered his office again carrying my phone. This time I photographed everything. Loan statements, account balances, property notices, credit warnings. My hands moved steadily beneath the soft yellow desk lamp while rain whispered against the windows outside. At the back of the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of tax folders, I found a sealed envelope from the mortgage company. Final notice before legal review. My pulse slowed strangely as I read the amount owed. This was no temporary problem. Richard had been drowning for a long time. And instead of asking for help, he had started selling pieces of my family to keep himself afloat. Upstairs, the old grandfather clock chimed midnight through the silent house. I carefully returned every document exactly where I found it before turning off the office light. Standing alone in the dark hallway, I suddenly understood something my mother tried teaching me years ago. Trust is not proven by how much you sacrifice for someone. It is proven by what they refuse to sacrifice from you when times become difficult. By Thursday evening, Richard seemed almost cheerful again. That unsettled me more than his anger ever could have. Men who panic openly at least reveal themselves honestly. But Richard moved through our house with the careful confidence of someone still convinced he could repair. Appearances before consequences arrived. He suggested we invite Claire over for dinner Saturday night. "It has been too long since we all sat down together," he said while reading the newspaper at breakfast. I looked up slowly from my coffee. Claire had barely visited in months before all of this started. Richard usually complained that she was too emotional, too dramatic, too sensitive about family issues. Yet now suddenly he wanted a warm family dinner. "That sounds nice," I answered calmly. He smiled faintly behind the newspaper, like he had restored something between us. Saturday arrived cold and windy. The maple leaves scattered across our backyard in streaks of gold and rust while I prepared dinner quietly in the kitchen. Pot roast, garlic mashed potatoes, roasted carrots. The same meal Richard requested every anniversary for years, because he claimed no restaurant ever made it better than I did. I used to take pride in that. The little domestic rituals that made a marriage feel personal. Permanent. Around 4 o'clock, I stood peeling carrots while Richard entered the kitchen carrying a bottle of red wine. "You look beautiful today," he said casually. I glanced toward him. He was dressed in the charcoal sweater I bought him last Christmas. The expensive one he claimed was too fancy for everyday use. "Thank you," I replied softly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound came from the knife tapping gently against the cutting board and Frank Sinatra playing quietly through the kitchen speaker. Ordinary sounds. Comfortable sounds. But beneath them sat something sharp and invisible neither of us acknowledged. Richard stepped closer and leaned one hand against the counter beside me. "I know things have felt tense lately," he said carefully. "But we are going to be all right. We are going to be all right." He said it with such confidence that I almost wondered if he truly believed it himself. "Are we?" I asked quietly. Richard gave a small tired smile. "Marriage goes through difficult seasons. We have survived 41 years together, Evelyn. That means something." I stared down at the carrots beneath my hands. 41 years. It sounded enormous when spoken aloud. Entire lifetimes existed inside those years. Holidays. Funerals. Mortgage payments. Grey hair slowly replacing brown. We had shared so much history together that part of me once believed history itself could protect a marriage from collapse. But history alone means nothing if honesty disappears. The doorbell rang at exactly 6. Claire entered carrying a pecan pie from the bakery near her office. The moment her eyes met mine across the hallway, I saw nervousness flicker across her face. Richard hugged her warmly anyway. "There is my girl," he said brightly. "It has been too long." Claire forced a smile while removing her coat. Dinner began almost normally. Richard poured wine generously and told stories about neighbors from the golf club renovating their lake house in Vermont. Claire nodded politely while barely touching her food. I sat quietly listening to both of them, struck by how exhausting pretending had become. Halfway through dinner, Richard lifted his wine glass slightly. "I was thinking maybe next summer we could all take a trip together," he said. "Maybe Maine. Somewhere peaceful near the water." Claire looked down at her plate immediately. I watched Richard carefully while he spoke. He still thought future plans could hold us together. Vacations. Family dinners. Flowers. Like a collapsing house could somehow be repaired by repainting the walls. "That sounds lovely," I said softly. Richard smiled with visible relief. For the first time in weeks, he looked relaxed sitting there beneath the warm dining room lights. The same lights that once illuminated anniversary toasts and Christmas dinners and birthday cakes across 4 decades of marriage. Claire suddenly set her fork down quietly against her plate. The sound seemed unnaturally loud inside the room. Richard looked toward her. "Everything okay?" Claire nodded too quickly. "Fine." But her voice sounded strained. I noticed her hands trembling slightly beneath the tablecloth. Richard reached for another piece of bread while continuing some story about rising property taxes in Fairfield County. Then casually, almost carelessly, he said something that made the entire room go still. "Honestly, people get too sentimental about possessions anyway," he said with a shrug. "At the end of the day, things are just things." My chest tightened instantly. Claire looked up sharply. Richard did not notice either of us reacting. He buttered his bread calmly and continued speaking. "People ruin relationships over objects when none of it matters once you are gone." I stared at him across the candlelight, while the meaning of his words settled slowly into the silence between us. To Richard, my mother's jewelry had become an inconvenience. A financial solution. Numbers on paper. But to me, those pieces carried fingerprints from women who no longer existed. Memories. Grief. Love. Entire generations reduced to auction listings, because my husband believed sentiment was weakness. Claire's eyes suddenly filled with tears she tried desperately to hide. Richard finally noticed. "Claire," he asked carefully. She looked directly at him then. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something shift inside her too. Not fear anymore. Resolve. The silence after Richard's comment stretched across the dining room like thin ice ready to crack beneath us. Claire kept staring down at her plate while her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. Richard looked between us with mild confusion, still unaware that the ground beneath his carefully constructed life had already started collapsing. "Claire," he asked again, softer this time. "Are you all right?" She let out a slow breath through her nose before finally lifting her eyes toward him. I had never seen her look at her father that way before. Not angry. Not emotional. Just tired. Deeply tired. "Dad," she said quietly, "how much did you get for Grandma Rose's jewelry?" The room went completely still. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder suddenly, each tick cutting through the silence with unbearable precision. Richard blinked once. Then he gave a short, awkward laugh. "What are you talking about?" Claire did not look away from him. "The auction." His face changed instantly. Not dramatically. Richard was too controlled for that. But the color drained slightly from his cheeks, and I saw his shoulders stiffen beneath the charcoal sweater. "Claire," he said carefully, "this is not the time." "No," she replied softly. "Actually, I think it is exactly the time." I sat perfectly still at the table with my hands folded in my lap while candlelight flickered gently across the dishes between us. Part of me felt strangely detached watching the moment unfold. Like I had stepped outside my own marriage and become an observer instead of a wife. Richard glanced toward me quickly. Measuring. Calculating. Trying to determine how much I knew. "Evelyn," he began calmly, "your mother's jewelry was never supposed to become some kind of family spectacle." Family spectacle. Such elegant language for theft. Claire slowly reached beside her chair and lifted a brown leather folder onto the table. The same folder I had seen at the diner days earlier. Richard's eyes locked onto it immediately. For the first time in 41 years, I saw genuine fear cross my husband's face. Claire opened the folder carefully and slid several papers across the table toward him. Auction receipts. Wire transfers. Debt notices. Every secret sitting openly beneath the dining room candles, where we once celebrated anniversaries and birthdays together. Richard stared down at the documents without touching them. "You went through my office?" he asked finally. His voice sounded cold now. "Sharp." Claire laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "That is what you are worried about." Richard pushed his chair back slightly from the table. "You had no right involving yourself in private financial matters." "Private?" Claire repeated quietly. "You sold her mother's wedding ring." The words landed heavily inside the room. Richard rubbed one hand across his forehead before finally looking toward me directly. "I was trying to protect this family." I almost spoke then. Almost asked him how destroying trust could possibly protect anything. But I stayed silent because suddenly I understood something important. Richard had spent decades controlling conversations by exhausting everyone emotionally around him. Excuses. Deflections. Calm explanations that slowly made other people doubt themselves. Tonight, for the first time, nobody interrupted the silence to make him comfortable. Claire pulled another paper from the folder and placed it carefully in front of him. "You were also trying to refinance the house without telling Evelyn." Richard's jaw tightened immediately. "That was temporary." "You are behind 6 mortgage payments," Claire said softly. "Nothing about this is temporary." I watched Richard carefully while she spoke. The man sitting across from me no longer resembled the husband I once trusted with my entire life. He looked smaller somehow. Not because he had lost money. Because lies always shrink people eventually. "I was going to fix everything," he said quietly after a long silence. "I just needed more time." More time. To sell more assets. To bury more debt. To continue smiling across dinner tables while dismantling our future piece by piece behind closed doors. I finally reached for the folder myself and looked down at the auction receipt listing my mother's wedding ring. Tiny engraved roses inside the gold band. Family heirloom. Sold. I traced the words slowly with my fingertips. Richard's voice softened suddenly. Evelyn. I looked up at him calmly. Do you know what hurts the most? I asked quietly. He stared at me without answering. Not the money. Not even the jewelry. My voice remained steady despite the ache spreading through my chest. It is the fact that every single day, after you sold those pieces, you came home and looked me in the eyes like nothing had happened. Richard opened his mouth slightly, but no words came out. Claire sat frozen beside us, tears shining quietly in her eyes. Outside, rain had started falling again, against the dining room windows. Soft. Constant. Endless. Richard looked down at the papers scattered across the table like he no longer recognized them. And in that moment, surrounded by candlelight and silence and 41 years of broken trust, I realized something unexpected. I was no longer afraid of losing my marriage. Because somewhere along the way, without even noticing it, Richard had already destroyed it himself. Nobody moved for a long time after that. Rain slid slowly down the dining room windows while the candles burned lower between us, their soft light reflecting against untouched wine glasses and half-finished plates. Richard remained staring at the papers scattered across the table like they belonged to someone else. Claire quietly wiped beneath her eyes with a napkin, but she did not look away from him anymore. The fear was gone now. Only disappointment remained. I think that hurt him more. Richard finally leaned back in his chair with a long exhausted sigh. In one single week, he suddenly looked older to me. Not physically. Spiritually. Like carrying years of deception had finally become too heavy to hide beneath expensive sweaters and careful smiles. I never wanted this to happen, he said quietly. I almost answered immediately, but then I stopped myself. Because after days of lies and excuses, I realized something important. Intentions no longer mattered to me. Consequences did. What exactly did you think was going to happen? Claire asked softly. Richard rubbed his forehead again. I thought I could recover the money before either of you found out. By selling her family history. Claire whispered. He looked toward me then. Evelyn, I was trying to save us. I held his gaze steadily across the candlelight. No, I said quietly. You were trying to save yourself. Silence settled heavily inside the room again, because deep down, all three of us knew it was true. Richard had not sold my mother's jewelry to protect our marriage. He sold it because he could not bear admitting failure. Somewhere along the way, preserving his image became more important to him than preserving trust. I slowly removed my wedding ring and placed it carefully beside my plate. The tiny sound of gold touching would seem to echo through the entire room. Richard's face changed instantly. Evelyn. His voice cracked slightly this time. Real fear at last. I looked down at the ring for a moment before speaking. Do you remember what you said when you gave this to me? He stared silently. You told me marriage only works when two people protect each other even when life becomes difficult. My fingers rested lightly against the ring. I believed you. Richard's eyes lowered toward the table. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked ashamed. Truly ashamed. But the strange thing about broken trust is that remorse arrives too late to rebuild what deception slowly destroyed. I cannot do this anymore, I said softly. Claire looked toward me quickly while Richard straightened in his chair. What does that mean? He asked carefully. I took a slow breath before answering. It means I spent 41 years protecting this marriage, while you spent years hiding the truth from me. My voice remained calm. Almost gentle. And I think I finally understand those are not the same thing. Richard pushed his chair back suddenly and stood near the table. So what now? There it was. The question underneath every argument. Every lie. Every apology. What now? I looked around the dining room slowly. The framed family photographs along the walls. The china cabinet filled with dishes collected over decades. The faint scent of rosemary and candle wax lingering in the air. An entire lifetime lived inside this house. Now, I said quietly, I stop pretending this is still the marriage I thought it was. Richard closed his eyes briefly like the words physically hurt him. Maybe they did. But pain alone does not erase betrayal. Claire stood slowly from the table and reached for her coat near the hallway. I should go, she whispered. I stood too. No, both of them looked at me. I think I would like some fresh air. Richard opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. I walked upstairs calmly and packed a small overnight bag. Nothing dramatic. A sweater. Medication. Toiletries. The blue scarf my mother knitted for me years ago. Downstairs, the house remained silent except for the grandfather clock ticking steadily through the hallway. When I returned to the foyer carrying my bag, Richard stood waiting near the staircase. He looked lost suddenly. Older. Smaller. Evelyn, he said quietly, please do not leave like this. I studied his face carefully one final time. The man I married still existed somewhere inside him perhaps. But trust once broken does not return simply because someone suddenly fears losing you. You did not sell jewelry, Richard, I said softly. You sold the last thing my mother trusted you to protect. His eyes filled immediately, but I continued anyway because some truths deserve to be spoken aloud at least once. And somewhere along the way, you stopped protecting me too. Outside, cold rain drifted softly through the dark Connecticut night as Claire carried my bag toward her car. I paused briefly on the front porch and looked back through the doorway at the house where I had spent most of my adult life. Then I turned away quietly without another word. Behind me, Richard remained standing alone beneath the warm hallway light while the front door slowly closed between us.